Hi, I'm John, and this is my video about Entity Framework Core. So in this video, I'm going to be giving a quick run through of Entity Framework Core. We're going to look at what it is, some of the key concepts of it, and some of the benefits to using it. So let's start by looking at what is Entity Framework Core. EF Core is an object relational mapping tool for .NET Core, or also known as .NET in more recent versions. And this is the successor to Entity Framework, which became part of the .NET framework. It's built into the .NET ecosystem and it's developed and provided by Microsoft, and it's a core component of .NET applications. Ultimately, EF Core allows you to work and interact with your database using C# and .NET without focusing on the underlying database technology. It's focused on relational databases and provides the best support for relational databases, but it is also improving in its support for NoSQL solutions. So now let's look at some of the concepts of EF Core. The first is the database context, and this is the most fundamental class involved in the running of EF Core. And this is a class that contains represents the session with the database. And I'm going to get more into some of the things that you find in the database context, but generally it acts as a bridge between the .NET application and the database. And it allows you to perform CRUD operations using .NET objects rather than raw SQL queries. The next concept is DB set, and this is one of the things that you'll find or write into your database context. And this defines a collection of a specific type of entity. So say if we've got a class for a certain object, we would define a DB set, which would then create a table in the database. So it represents a table in the database. The next concept is migrations, and these represent a way to keep your database schema in sync with your .NET entity classes. So as we're writing our data structure and our schema through that DB context using those DB sets that represent the tables, over time our classes and models are going to change. The number of tables are going to change as the application evolves. The schema of the database needs to evolve too. So migrations are the mechanism to update the database schema as your application evolves. These migrations are kept indefinitely in the project unless they're merged into one, and you will use these migrations the same as you would on your development machine as you're testing the migrations, which will then go through to production and carry out the same action. The next concept is language integrated query, also known as LINQ. So traditionally we've got raw SQL queries that we might use to query the database, and this might be something like select star from table name where something is equal to true or false, etc. Now, language integrated query allows us to perform queries natively in C#. And what EF Core does is convert the LINQ query into a raw SQL query. So we don't need to work with the raw SQL query. This is all handled by Entity Framework Core for us. But LINQ is also used to query in-memory collections, XML and more. So it's a uniform experience querying various different things, but one of them is the database. The next concept is tracking, and this allows database context to keep track of changes made to entities retrieved from or associated with it. It allows us to persist changes using save changes without any additional code. It allows lazy loading, which isn't supported if we don't use tracking. and it has additional overhead on performance, though it can provide benefits to performance also, as long as we use it in the correct scenarios. It's less appropriate for read-only scenarios where we're retrieving a lot of objects and we're not going to be making changes. It's not very beneficial to use tracking, and we'll have that additional performance overhead that we don't need. So ultimately, tracking allows us to track our objects as they're changed. The final concept is lazy loading, and lazy loading allows us to retrieve objects from the database only when they're required. So if we have a link query that's grabbing all objects and related objects in a different table, although we're grabbing all those in our query, we may not necessarily use them all. And if we're not using lazy loading, then we're going to grab all of that data, which might have a performance overhead, use network bandwidth and stuff like that with the database server. So lazy loading allows us to query in the same way, but we will only actually fetch that data from the database as each individual object is being called. And this can be beneficial in performance on that initial query. In some scenarios, if it's not used in the appropriate situations, then it can have a detrimental experience on performance. Say, for example, we've got lazy loading, but we're actually going to use many of those objects, and as we're calling those objects, going to be making constant calls back to the database to retrieve those objects, in which case it will be detrimental in performance. So lazy loading ultimately can be very beneficial if used correctly, but should be avoided in other scenarios depending on your use case. So to summarise, the benefits of EF Core are that you can interact through the database using .NET objects. So you can use C#, the programming language and the framework you're familiar with, to interact with the database. And it's uniform from the code you write into the way that you're querying objects. It's all going to be C# native language. We're not going to need to deal with raw SQL queries and stuff like that. Doing it this way also allows us to spend more time on business logic. So if we're using those migrations, we're defining our models, our DB context, and then we're using migrations to create the database to represent that model or to fit that model, then that's less time for us to be worrying about the database design and getting into all the underlying database technology. With that being said, an understanding of the underlying database technology is important, especially as you get into more complex applications, high performance applications that you're running in production. It's still important to have that knowledge, but generally it does allow us to spend less time on the designing the database and more time on the business logic and adding value. EF Core also has flexible support for different database types, which is beneficial, and it's also seamlessly integrated with the .NET ecosystem. That concludes my presentation on Entity Framework Core. Thank you for watching.